The sound of rain echoed against the gates of Buckingham Palace, a rhythmic backdrop to the moment that would later be remembered as one of the most defining in modern royal history. Inside the grand white and gold study of King Charles III, silence ruled. The king sat at a polished oak desk once used by his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders. In front of him lay a single document, stamped with the crimson crest of the British crown. Its language was formal, its tone coldly absolute. At the bottom was space for one signature, his. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Outside those palace walls, millions had no idea what was about to happen. Across the world, royal commentators were speculating about upcoming engagements. Analysts were discussing public approval ratings, and gossip pages were filled with speculation about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's next move. But inside the palace that night, something irreversible was in motion. A decree, decades in the making, was about to erase Meghan Markle's name from royal history. The document stated, in clear and unambiguous words, "Her privileges are hereby revoked." For the first time since the abdication crisis of 1936, a reigning British monarch was preparing to strip a family member of all royal recognition, not out of romance but out of duty. And beside the king stood his sister, Princess, and the embodiment of royal discipline. She said little, but her presence alone told the story. This was no rash act. It was the end of a long, deliberate process that had begun years earlier, when trust fractured, loyalty thinned, and the monarchy's patience finally reached its breaking point. The air in the study felt dense, heavy with memory. Charles glanced toward the portrait of his mother. He had inherited not just her crown but her burden, to preserve the monarchy, no matter the personal cost. For months he had postponed this decision, hoping that time might heal the wounds that had divided his family. Yet the reports kept coming. Meghan's defiance, her refusal to yield to the palace's expectations, the endless media battles. All of it had reached a threshold that could no longer be ignored. Princess and stood at his right, her expression unreadable. Known for her no-nonsense approach, she had long been the monarchy's moral compass. "You can't protect the institution by pretending nothing's wrong," she had told Charles weeks earlier. "You have to draw the line, and this is it." Her words carried the same blunt honesty that had defined her public life. In Anne's view, the monarchy was not a stage for personal ambition or emotional indulgence. It was an institution built on service, duty, and restraint. And Meghan, in her eyes, had broken every rule that sustained it. For Charles, the choice was not between affection and authority. It was between legacy and erosion. Every headline, every viral clip, every televised interview had chipped away at the monarchy's credibility. The late Queen had once described duty as the unseen anchor of the crown. But in the years since Harry and Meghan's departure, that anchor had begun to drift. The public saw division where there should have been unity. And while the world debated who was right or wrong, the king faced a far more urgent reality. A monarchy cannot survive perpetual conflict. As the fountain pens were uncapped and the witnesses prepared, a strange quiet filled the room. Anne's steady hand rested on the edge of the table, signaling that the time for hesitation had passed. The decree would not only remove Meghan's title as Duchess of Sussex, it would also revoke her privileges associated with royal representation, patronage, and ceremonial precedence. It was, in every sense, an erasure. Yet it was not an act of anger. It was, as Charles would later describe privately, an act of preservation. The decision had not come easily. Insiders say the king had spent nights awake, reviewing the implications with constitutional advisors and royal historians. Could the monarchy withstand another scandal if he did nothing? Would leniency be seen as weakness? What message would it send to future generations of royals if boundaries were blurred beyond repair? The answers were as painful as they were clear. To safeguard the institution, one must sometimes sacrifice its members. Beyond the palace, news networks were already sensing a disturbance. Royal correspondents noticed unusual movement around the palace gates. Staff whispered in corridors. Emails were exchanged late into the night between departments labeled confidential. When dawn broke, the official press release was ready. It was brief, barely 50 words, but it would ignite a global firestorm. It read, "By the order of His Majesty King Charles III, and with the full counsel of Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, the privileges and styles associated with the Duchess of Sussex are hereby revoked. This decision reflects the Crown's commitment to the integrity and continuity of the monarchy." Within minutes, the statement was everywhere. Television anchors repeated it with disbelief. Social media erupted. The world had grown accustomed to royal controversies, but this was different. This was the monarchy taking a stand. And at the center of the storm was Meghan Markle, once hailed as a modernizing force, now cast as a symbol of defiance. When Meghan received the news, sources close to her described her as shaken, tearful, and silent for hours. She had always believed she could redefine what it meant to be royal, independent, outspoken, self-directed. She had walked into the monarchy determined to change it. Now, the monarchy had changed her. In one sweep of a pen, the word Duchess vanished from her future. Invitations, charitable affiliations, and official records would be rewritten. Even her name on the court circular, the official diary of royal engagements, was removed. For many observers, it was the final chapter of a story that began as a fairy tale. The American actress who captured a prince's heart, celebrated by crowds and headlines, had become the woman the Crown could no longer embrace. But for Charles and Anne, sentimentality had no place in the equation. The monarchy, they believed, could not coexist with rebellion disguised as independence. And, ever the pragmatist, had framed the issue succinctly in private. A monarchy that forgets discipline invites its own demise. And Charles, though haunted by the human side of the decision, found solace in duty. "My mother's legacy must stand," he reportedly said to a senior aide. "We can mourn what's lost later. For now, we must protect what remains." The world's response was immediate and polarizing. Some praised the king's resolve, calling it a long-overdue move to reassert royal authority. Others condemned it as cruel, punitive, and outdated. Yet behind the public reactions lay a deeper question. Had Meghan truly understood the cost of stepping into the royal arena? To those within the institution, royalty is not a title but a discipline, a lifelong submission to structure and silence. To those outside, it often looks like a cage gilded in gold. The symbolism of this moment was impossible to ignore. On the same desk where Queen Elizabeth once signed letters of state and acts of parliament, her son now signed a decree that would rewrite family history. The seal pressed down with a dull thud, final, irreversible. And as the ink dried, the monarchy entered a new chapter defined not by inclusion but by boundary. That single act, the erasure of Meghan's name from royal records, was not just administrative. It was emotional theater on a national stage. It signaled to the world that the Crown, though modernized in many ways, still held the power to enforce its ancient will. It reminded citizens that beneath the glamour and charity work lies a machine that values survival above sentiment. By the following morning, newspapers across Britain carried near-identical headlines. King Charles ends Meghan's royal chapter. Television panels debated whether it was justice or vengeance. Outside the palace, tourists gathered, snapping photos by the gates, unaware that history had shifted overnight. Inside Windsor, Princess Anne reportedly walked the grounds alone at dawn. To her, the act had been necessary but regrettable. She understood the pain it caused, especially to her nephew Harry. Yet she also believed that the monarchy could not endure endless tension. "Every family faces rebellion," she once told a confidant. "But only a royal family faces it in front of the world." For Charles, there was no celebration, only relief mixed with sorrow. He had not sought confrontation but clarity. His reign had begun under the shadow of transition. It would now be defined by resolve. By drawing the line here, he hoped to secure the future, for William, for George, and for the institution itself. But even as the monarchy stabilized, questions lingered. Could any family truly recover from such a fracture? Could trust ever be rebuilt between father and son? between the institution and those who had once carried its titles? These questions, like the echo of the rain that night, would not fade easily. The image of that signed decree, the king's signature beside the crimson seal, and his initials in the margin, would come to symbolize a moment when the monarchy reasserted its identity in an age of chaos. It was not just about Meghan Markle. It was about the crown reclaiming control. And yet, for millions watching around the world, it felt personal. The collapse of a dream, the closing of a chapter that had once promised unity, progress, and love. This was the moment King Charles erased Meghan Markle from the monarchy. The decision would ripple across families, nations, and generations. And as the world tried to understand how the fairy tale had turned into a reckoning, one truth became clear. The crown had spoken, and there would be no going back. The royal decree lay on a velvet-lined tray, its edges illuminated by the faint glow of a single desk lamp. The room was steeped in silence, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock. This was not a public ceremony. There were no photographers, no grand speeches, no televised addresses. It was an act meant to preserve the dignity of the crown and to draw a boundary between loyalty and defiance. The document bore the full authority of the sovereign, written in language so formal it almost hid the pain behind it. At the top, the phrase "by royal command" was engraved. Beneath it, the cold precision of the words that would end an era. Her privileges are hereby revoked. To understand the magnitude of what King Charles was about to sign, one must first understand the sacred weight of royal decrees. These were not political statements or symbolic gestures. In the history of the British monarchy, such orders had the force of permanence. Once written, they became part of the crown's constitutional memory. The last time a royal decree had caused such shock was nearly a century ago, when Edward VIII abdicated to Mary Wallis Simpson. But this was no abdication. It was an expulsion. Princess and had been instrumental in shaping the language of the decree. Her tone was pragmatic, stripped of emotion. For weeks, she had been the king's quiet strategist, advising him on how to act decisively while keeping the institution's image intact. Her reasoning was simple. Leniency had become a liability. The monarchy had endured centuries by knowing when to forgive and when to protect itself. In Anne's eyes, the Sussex saga had crossed the line from inconvenience to threat. In the days leading up to the signing, legal advisors drafted multiple versions of the document. The first was too soft, filled with euphemisms about transitioning away from royal obligations, and rejected it outright. The second version, more firm, spoke of realignment of titles. Still, she found it lacking. What she demanded was clarity, language that would stand in the records of history without ambiguity. It was and who insisted on the phrase "revoked." It carried the weight of finality, the sound of a door closing forever. Charles was not blind to what the decision meant. He knew that stripping Meghan's titles would ignite a storm far beyond the palace walls. It would deepen divisions, trigger accusations of cruelty, and perhaps sever what little remained of his relationship with Harry. Yet he also knew that hesitation was no longer an option. For months, public trust in the monarchy had been eroding under the constant barrage of interviews, documentaries, and memoirs that seemed to target the royal family itself. Every silence from the palace had been interpreted as weakness. Every statement from the Sussexes was seen as rebellion. The king had reached the point where silence could no longer defend the throne. On the evening before the decree was made public, Charles summoned his private secretary and requested solitude. He wanted to read the document one final time. Witnesses later described the scene in hushed tones. The king sat in his armchair, his glasses resting low on his nose, reading each word slowly, as though testing the strength of every sentence. Occasionally he would glance at the portrait of his mother that hung above the mantel, a quiet reminder of the standard he was expected to uphold. The late queen had faced countless storms, but she had always chosen discretion. Charles, however, was facing a different age, one where scandal moved faster than silence, and reputation was measured in headlines. At the far end of the room, Princess Anne waited. She did not interrupt or offer advice. She simply stood, her presence a steady reminder that this was not an act of vengeance, but of necessity. When Charles finally looked up, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but both understood the gravity of what was about to happen, and broke the silence first. "You've carried this long enough," she said softly. "It's time." The king nodded. His pen hovered for a moment above the page, his hand trembling slightly. In that hesitation lay the full conflict of his heart, a father's affection against a monarch's duty. Then, with a single motion, he signed his name. The ink sank into the parchment, final and absolute. At that instant, the monarchy had spoken. The document was then handed to the keeper of the Privy Seal, who would oversee its registration into the Crown Archives. The act itself was procedural, but its symbolism echoed across generations. In the royal tradition, the seal is more than a stamp. It is the voice of the sovereign. When pressed onto parchment, it transforms ink into law, sentiment into permanence. Princess Anne watched the seal impression take shape. Her expression did not change, but those close to her later described her eyes as fierce with conviction. She had been through countless crises, the divorces of her siblings, scandals that threatened to weaken the family's image, but she had never wavered. To her, this was not cruelty. It was maintenance. "You can't let decay set in," she once said. "If you do, the structure collapses." While the internal process unfolded, the outer machinery of the monarchy began its silent coordination. Communications teams drafted carefully worded releases. Security personnel reviewed potential threats. Legal advisors confirmed that the decree would not violate any of the constitutional precedents governing the royal household. Even the language of the public announcement was refined repeatedly to balance gravity and restraint. There would be no emotional commentary, no hint of triumph, only facts. That morning, the Royal Press Office received its final version. By the order of His Majesty the King, and with the counsel of Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, the privileges and titles of the Duchess of Sussex are hereby rescinded. It was the first time the monarchy had ever used the word rescinded in reference to a royal family member in modern history. That single word carried centuries of authority. Within hours of its release, it became the most discussed statement in Britain. Behind the scenes, not everyone agreed with the move. Some senior courtiers expressed concern that it would appear punitive, even medieval. Others feared it would invite sympathy for Meghan and Harry, painting them as victims rather than rebels. But Anne countered each argument with precision. "It's not about perception," she said during one internal meeting. "It's about boundaries. You can't serve the crown and undermine it at the same time." For Charles, the decision marked both an end and a beginning. He had finally acted as sovereign rather than father, drawing a distinction between personal pain and royal obligation. Yet the emotional toll was immense. That evening, he walked alone through the palace gardens, avoiding any engagement with staff. To those who saw him, he looked aged, drained, and introspective. Some whispered that he carried the same haunted expression his mother had worn after the death of Diana, the look of a monarch who must bear private sorrow for public order. As for Princess Anne, she returned to her residence with a rare sense of solemn satisfaction. In her view, this was the moment when the monarchy reasserted its spine. She believed the institution had been drifting toward vulnerability, weakened by the modern obsession with transparency and self-expression. To her, the monarchy's strength had always come from mystery, duty, and restraint. "If the crown bends too often," she once remarked, "one day it won't straighten again." The next morning, copies of the decree were dispatched to official archives and relevant departments, including the Lord Chamberlain's office and the College of Arms. Every record that bore Meghan's title would be updated or replaced. It was a meticulous process, one designed not just for order but for symbolism. The monarchy's message was clear. The institution remembers everything, but it also knows how to erase. Meanwhile, the press had caught wind of what had happened behind closed doors. Reporters camped outside palace gates, cameras trained on every car entering and leaving. Public curiosity surged into obsession. Was this the end of the Sussex story, or the beginning of a new feud between the monarchy and its most controversial couple? Inside editorial rooms, headlines were crafted with urgency. "The Crown draws the line. King Charles restores discipline. Princess Anne the enforcer. The tone varied, but the fascination was universal. For the first time in years, the monarchy seemed less like a relic of the past and more like a living drama, a blend of power, betrayal, and consequence. As the news spread across continents, reactions poured in. In America, Meghan's supporters decried the act as vindictive and regressive. In the United Kingdom, royal traditionalists hailed it as a necessary reassertion of authority. Social media fractured into factions, each claiming to understand the truth better than the other. But within the palace, there was only quiet acknowledgement. The king and his sister had done what they believed was right for the survival of the crown. What most outsiders could not grasp was how personal this was for both Charles and Anne. They were not simply punishing a daughter-in-law. They were defending an idea, a system of values that had shaped their lives since birth. They had watched their mother dedicate 7 decades to service, sacrificing privacy, emotion, and comfort in the name of continuity. To see that legacy undermined by public rebellion felt like betrayal of the highest order. When Charles retired that night, he reportedly paused once more by his mother's portrait. He murmured something indistinct, as though seeking her approval across time. Perhaps it was an apology, or perhaps a quiet justification. The crown had endured another test. The monarchy had chosen duty over sentiment once again. And so, the line had been drawn in royal ink. A decree that would echo through history as both a warning and a declaration. From that moment on, the royal family was no longer a collection of individuals bound by affection. It was once again what it had always claimed to be, an institution built on duty, hierarchy, and sacrifice. This was the royal decree, a line in the sand from which there would be no return. Princess Anne had never been one for sentiment. Her world was defined by precision, protocol, and practicality. Those who knew her well described her as the one royal who never sought attention, yet commanded it effortlessly. Her presence was quiet but unwavering, her words blunt but rarely wrong. In moments of crisis, she did not panic, she did not posture. She assessed, decided, and acted. And in the matter of Meghan Markle, Anne's stance had been clear long before the final decree was ever drafted. In royal circles, whispers about and skepticism toward Meghan had been circulating since the earliest days of Harry's engagement. To Anne, who had lived through decades of scandal, spectacle, and shifting public loyalties, the arrival of an American actress into the family had always represented a risk. She saw in Meghan not malice but ambition, a quality that, in her experience, did not blend well with monarchy. The royal system, after all, was not a stage for self-expression but an arena of self-restraint. When Meghan first joined the family, and had watched the fanfare unfold with detached curiosity, she had seen this pattern before. The public's hunger for novelty, the press's appetite for contrast, the inevitable comparisons to Diana, and the mounting expectations that no human could sustain. In Anne's eyes, Meghan was entering a world that demanded obedience and offered scrutiny in return. And when the Duchess began speaking about modernizing the monarchy, advocating independence, and reshaping royal traditions, Anne's patience thinned. She doesn't understand what this is, and reportedly told a confidant in the early months of Meghan's royal life. This isn't a job you reinvent. It's a life you endure. That statement captured the core of Anne's philosophy. To her, royal duty was not about applause or progress, it was about preservation. She had dedicated her life to maintaining the monarchy's stability, serving without complaint, and staying out of personal drama. To witness someone treat royal status as a platform rather than a responsibility was, in her view, the ultimate violation of trust. Anne's influence within the family was not loud but absolute. Charles, despite being king, relied on her judgment more than he would ever publicly admit. While others in the family sought emotional validation or political advice, and offered clarity. She was the one who reminded Charles that monarchy was not a democracy. It could not afford endless accommodation. Her strength came from her consistency. Through decades of change, divorces, deaths, and public criticisms, and had remained the constant. In the months before the decree, the atmosphere between Charles and Anne had grown tense yet purposeful. They spent long hours in private discussion, reviewing documents, weighing implications, and examining public sentiment. Charles worried about the repercussions, the optics, and the possible media backlash, and dismissed those concerns with a wave of her hand. "We've spent too long managing perceptions," she said during one late-night meeting. "It's time we manage standards." Her approach to leadership was shaped by her upbringing. As a young woman and had observed how her mother, the late Queen, dealt with disobedience and controversy. The Queen never raised her voice. She never argued publicly. She simply acted with the authority of history behind her, and inherited that steel. She had learned that in the royal family, silence could be a weapon, and restraint a form of power. Behind closed doors, she became the architect of what insiders quietly referred to as the boundary plan. This plan outlined the steps necessary to distance the crown from the Sussexes in an orderly, constitutional manner. It detailed how to adjust communications, titles, and official records without violating the laws of succession or royal protocol. While lawyers and aides handled the paperwork and defined the principle, "This is not exile, this is correction." To her, the issue went beyond personal grievance. It was about setting precedent. If the monarchy allowed public dissent from within, what would stop future generations from treating it as a stage for personal grievances? And allowing such behavior to continue would invite erosion from within. "A crown that bends to every opinion loses its shape," she told one aide. "We cannot let emotion dictate the standard." Her relationship with Charles during this period was marked by a mix of loyalty and firmness. The king often leaned toward compassion, torn between his role as father and sovereign, and, unencumbered by sentiment, reminded him that kingship demanded separation from personal feeling. "You cannot lead if you fear loss," she told him. "The monarchy has survived worse, but it never survived indulgence." Those words would stay with Charles as he faced the most painful decision of his reign, and had not demanded the revocation of Meghan's titles for personal satisfaction. She had done so to protect the framework that had defined their lives. To her, every royal bore an invisible debt, to the public, to tradition, to history itself. And when one failed to honor that debt, the entire institution suffered. In private correspondence with senior palace advisors, and outlined her reasoning in precise language. "The Duchess has chosen a public identity independent of the monarchy," she wrote in one memo. "It is therefore inconsistent for her to retain styles and privileges that imply representation of the crown." The tone was unemotional, the logic airtight. This was how Anne operated, through structure, not sentiment. Within the palace, many saw Anne as the enforcer. She was not vindictive, but she had little tolerance for what she considered irresponsibility. Unlike others who sought comfort in compromise, she believed clarity was a form of mercy. It ended confusion before it could become chaos. "It's kinder to end something cleanly than to let it rot," she once remarked during a briefing. Her counsel extended beyond paperwork. She also addressed the human side of the matter, how the family would navigate the emotional consequences. She warned Charles that the decision would wound Harry deeply, but argued that sparing him now would only prolong his conflict with the crown. "He needs to see the boundary," she said, "not for punishment, but for peace." There was also a private moment between brother and sister that few witnessed but many later spoke about. On the eve of the signing, Charles had asked Anne whether she felt any regret about what was to come. Her response was measured but honest. "Regret doesn't change necessity," she said. "You can love someone and still know they've crossed a line. The monarchy isn't built on comfort. It's built on correction." Those words encapsulated Anne's worldview. She did not believe in cruelty, only in consequence. Her entire life had been a study in duty's endurance. She had seen the crown survive wars, scandals, and global shifts, and through it all, she had remained the same. For her, this decision was not an ending but a restoration, a reaffirmation of what the monarchy was meant to be. Publicly, she said nothing, while commentators speculated about her role and kept her silence. She attended her engagements, shook hands, and smiled for photographs. But within royal circles, everyone knew she had been the decisive force behind the decree. Her reputation for integrity made her arguments unassailable. Even critics of the monarchy admitted that Anne's involvement lent the decision legitimacy. She was the one royal the public still trusted completely. When the announcement became public and avoided interviews or commentary, her schedule continued as usual: charity events, official visits, military duties. But behind the composure, she was acutely aware of the impact her advice had triggered. She received letters, some of praise, others of anger. Supporters thanked her for defending the crown. Detractors accused her of destroying family unity. She read every message but responded to none. In private, she confided to a close aide that she felt no pride in what had happened, only relief that it was finally done. "It's unpleasant, but it's clean," she said. "That's the best you can hope for in this family." Her words echoed the pragmatism that had guided her entire career, and had never sought power, but she had always understood its price. While others enjoyed the privileges of royalty, she carried its burdens with quiet discipline. She saw herself as a custodian, not a celebrity. To her, the monarchy's purpose was endurance, and endurance required correction, not indulgence. In the aftermath of the decree, Charles leaned on, and more than ever. The public storm was intense. Pundits debated motives, historians drew comparisons to the abdication crisis, and social media amplified every rumor. Through it all, Anne remained unflinching. She advised the king to refrain from explanations. "Let the act speak for itself," she told him. "Silence lasts longer than statements." Her strategy worked. While the controversy raged outside, the monarchy itself remained composed, its operations uninterrupted. The message was unmistakable. The institution had acted with resolve, not resentment. In the weeks that followed, as the furor began to fade, Anne continued her duties without alteration. She appeared at agricultural shows, naval ceremonies, and foundation events, each time embodying the same stoic professionalism that had defined her life. Those who approached her about the controversy were met with the same response she had given for decades: "I'm here to do my job." Through that calm persistence, she achieved something no statement could have accomplished. She demonstrated that monarchy, at its core, was not about emotion but function. It existed to serve, not to please. Anne's quiet power was not measured in popularity or publicity. It was measured in the steadiness with which she upheld the institution when others faltered. And in this defining moment, when the monarchy faced one of its most difficult reckonings, it was her clarity that guided the king's hand. For Charles, her counsel had been both a shield and a mirror. It protected him from indecision and forced him to confront the truth. And as he looked back on the events that had led to that fateful signature, he understood one thing above all: without his sister's unflinching sense of duty, he might never have found the courage to act. Princess Anne had not just advised the king. She had preserved the crown. The corridors of Buckingham Palace often feel eternal, unchanging, untouched by the turbulence of the outside world. But in the weeks leading up to the signing of the decree, those same corridors carried a different kind of energy. The hush that usually conveyed dignity now felt heavy, as if the very walls were waiting for a decision only one man could make. King Charles III had always understood that his reign would be one of transition. He had spent decades in waiting, shaping his ideas about modernization, responsibility, and compassion. Yet he had not imagined that the greatest test of his kingship would come not from politics or public reform, but from within his own family. From the moment the controversy surrounding Harry and Meghan began, Charles found himself walking a tightrope stretched between his love as a father and his duty as sovereign. The two roles demanded different versions of him, and increasingly, those versions could not coexist. He had watched, for years, as the situation deteriorated, each interview, each book, each accusation pulling the threads of trust thinner until there was almost nothing left to hold. Privately, he wished the matter could have ended differently. Publicly, he knew that wishing solved nothing. As king, Charles had been raised to separate emotion from decision. His mother had mastered that art so well that few ever glimpsed the depth of her personal struggles. He admired her for it, yet he had never possessed her impenetrable calm. Charles was a thinker, a man who sought meaning in every action, who wrestled with the morality behind the mandates of power. When the question of revoking Meghan's titles was first raised, his immediate instinct had been hesitation. He wanted to believe that reconciliation was possible, that with time, the wounds could heal. But as months turned into years, the headlines continued to carve away at the monarchy's image. Each controversy that reached the press felt like a blow not only to the institution but to his mother's legacy. He spent many sleepless nights alone in his private quarters, surrounded by papers, reports, and correspondence. His aides often found him awake past midnight, reading old letters from the Queen, notes from his father, even transcripts of past constitutional discussions. Those letters carried reminders of the values instilled in him since childhood: patience, duty, endurance. But they also carried warnings that sentiment and leadership rarely shared the same space. He understood that now with painful clarity. When he looked at the situation with Meghan, he saw not only a daughter-in-law who had challenged the crown, but also a reflection of the world's changing expectations. The monarchy had always been criticized, but never in such a public, persistent, and personal way. The couple's departure to America had not ended the story. It had only relocated the theater. Each new appearance, each remark, each accusation made by the Sussexes was another reminder that the monarchy's private disputes had become global entertainment. Charles's dilemma was not simply about image. It was about the essence of monarchy itself. Was it possible to be both modern and disciplined? Could the institution survive in an era that demanded transparency, yet still required mystery to sustain its allure? His heart told him to reach out, to find common ground, to heal. His crown reminded him that compassion without structure could become weakness. In the early weeks of deliberation, Charles sought counsel from several advisors. The Privy Council urged caution. Constitutional lawyers recommended clarity. Public opinion polls painted a divided picture. Some wanted forgiveness, others demanded firmness. It was Princess Anne's unwavering stance that finally forced Charles to confront what he had been avoiding. During one private discussion in Sandringham, she told him, "You're thinking like a father, not a king." The words struck him harder than she intended. He realized she was right. The crown was not a family. It was an institution that occasionally happened to be run by one. If he blurred that distinction, he risked undermining everything his mother had built. The decision to remove Meghan's titles was therefore not an act of anger but of recognition. The crown could not function on sentiment. Despite his resolve, the emotional cost was visible. Those close to him described a man carrying the burden of conflicting loyalties. He often spoke of Harry with affection, remembering the boy he had raised, the son who had once followed him through the gardens of Highgrove, laughing, curious, loyal. That image clashed painfully with the reality of public interviews and bitter words broadcast across continents. When asked about the tension, Charles reportedly sighed, "It's the quiet that hurts most, the silence between us." He replayed memories in his mind, wondering where the rift had truly begun. Some said it started when Harry felt overshadowed, others when Meghan felt unprotected. For Charles, it did not matter anymore where the first crack appeared. What mattered was that the structure was now compromised. He understood that love could not repair an institution, and regret could not restore order. The monarchy's survival depended on firmness, and firmness often required sacrifice. On the night before he signed the decree, Charles sought solitude in the chapel within the palace grounds. It was late. The corridors were dark except for the faint flicker of candlelight. There, surrounded by silence, he prayed, not for vindication, but for clarity. He asked for the strength to do what needed to be done without letting bitterness take root. The soft echo of his voice in the chapel was the only sound in the vast space. When he left, the decision felt less like punishment and more like inevitability. Charles had always been sensitive to symbolism, and this act was not lost on him. He knew that signing the decree would echo through history, that it would be dissected by scholars and dramatized by storytellers. He also knew it would redefine how his reign would be remembered. His mother had been the matriarch of unity. He would become the monarch of boundaries. It was not the role he had wanted, but it was the one history demanded of him. After the document was signed, Charles felt no relief, only an odd stillness. Those who saw him described a man both lighter and older, as if the act had taken something from him. He retreated to his study and poured himself a glass of water, staring at the empty space on his desk where the decree had been. The ink was barely dry, but already he understood that he had crossed an invisible line. There would be no going back. In the days that followed, he avoided public appearances, delegating engagements to other members of the family. He spent long hours reading correspondence from palace officials and the press office, monitoring the reaction. The criticism was fierce, but so was the support. Traditionalists hailed him for restoring authority. Reformists called him rigid and archaic. Yet amid the noise, Charles focused only on one thing: stability. He knew that time had a way of reframing even the harshest decisions. His private thoughts, however, betrayed the toll. Those close to him noticed the subtle shifts. A slower gait, a distracted gaze, moments when he seemed to drift mid-conversation. The king, always known for his introspection, now carried the look of a man haunted by the cost of his choices. He did not regret the act itself, but he grieved what it represented. The official acknowledgement that his family's fractures had become permanent. He often found himself thinking about his mother's final years. The Queen had weathered storms of her own, the collapse of marriages, the loss of Diana, the waves of public criticism. But through it all, she had maintained a simple rule: never explain, never complain. Charles admired that principle, but he found it harder to embody. He was a man who felt deeply, who internalized conflict until it became part of him. In private, he once told an aide, "I understand now why she carried that silence. It's the only way to survive." Despite the pain, he remained committed to his choice. He understood that leadership was rarely about comfort. Every monarch, he reflected, inherits not only a crown but also the unfinished decisions of their predecessors. His mother had preserved unity. His task was to preserve authority. In a world where tradition was constantly questioned, he had to show that the crown still possessed a spine. In the weeks that followed, Charles found solace in work. He immersed himself in environmental initiatives, state meetings, and planning for upcoming Commonwealth visits. Yet even in these routines, the shadow of the decision lingered. During one engagement, as he greeted members of the public, a bystander shouted, "Was it worth it, Your Majesty?" Charles did not react. He continued walking, but those close enough to see his face noticed the faint tightening of his jaw. Privately, he wrestled with that question himself. Was it worth it? Had he acted as a king or as a father desperate for control? The answer shifted depending on the day. But one belief remained constant. Without order, the monarchy would crumble into spectacle. That thought kept him resolute. Every reign is defined by one pivotal act, one decision that reveals the true nature of the sovereign. For Charles, this was it. He had chosen structure over sentiment, clarity over confusion. He had followed his sister's counsel, his own conscience, and the weight of history. And though the world debated his motives, he knew that time, not opinion, would determine whether he had done right. In the privacy of his thoughts, he hoped that one day his son might understand, not forgive perhaps, but understand. He hoped that Harry would see the difference between personal pain and royal responsibility. He hoped that, in some distant future, the family might find a way back to grace, even if the titles never returned. For now, though, he carried on. Each morning, the king's schedule resumed with the same precision, the same ritual of duty. Yet beneath the polished surface of royal routine, the man within the crown remained caught between two worlds, the world of blood and the world of burden. And as night fell again over Buckingham Palace, Charles sat alone by the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars. He had made his choice. The monarchy was safe, the decree was sealed, and history would record his resolve. But somewhere deep inside, The father who once held his son's hand still grieved for the man that boy had become. This was the cost of kingship, the loneliness that follows duty. It was not a lesson learned, but one inherited. And in the silence of that long night, King Charles understood the truth that every ruler eventually faces. To preserve the crown, you must first surrender your heart. Meghan sat in silence, staring at her phone as the palace statement spread like wildfire across every platform she had ever used to shape her voice. The words blurred as she read them again and again. Her privileges are hereby revoked. It didn't feel real at first. There had been rumors for months, speculation for years, but never this. Never the official confirmation that her royal name, her hard-fought identity as the Duchess of Sussex, had been stripped away by royal decree. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely powerless. Her world, which had once revolved around control of image, message, and narrative, was slipping beyond her reach. The phone buzzed constantly with calls from agents, lawyers, and publicists, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Each vibration only deepened the ache inside her chest. The line she had crossed with the monarchy could no longer be smoothed over with charm or diplomacy. The breaking point hadn't come in one moment. It had been a slow erosion of trust. Every televised appearance, every op-ed, every interview had pushed the rift wider until it no longer resembled a family feud, but a public campaign. Meghan had convinced herself that she could redefine royalty, that she could merge independence with duty, celebrity with service. Yet in the end, the crown had chosen tradition over transformation, and she was the casualty of that decision. When the first news outlets began reporting the story, her name was everywhere again, but this time with an undertone of finality. Stripped of all royal titles, read the headlines. Erased from the monarchy. Commentators debated her legacy while strangers dissected her marriage, her motives, and her every expression. The woman who had once commanded global fascination was now being described in past tense, as if her existence within royal history had already concluded. Inside her home in Montecito, the atmosphere was tense. Harry paced the floor while aides tried to confirm details through palace contacts. Meghan sat still, her thoughts drifting to the first time she had walked into Buckingham Palace years earlier, nervous but hopeful, believing that her background, her modernity, her compassion could bring something new to an ancient institution. She had imagined partnership. Instead, she had found walls, old, invisible, and unyielding. Now those same walls had closed entirely. Every official record that had once carried her title would be updated. Court documents, charity affiliations, ceremonial rosters. Even her nameplate at patronage events would disappear. It wasn't merely a loss of honorifics. It was an erasure of identity within the only system that had ever rivaled Hollywood in power. In private, Meghan wept not out of shock, but exhaustion. The years of defending, explaining, and redefining had worn her down. Every decision she made seemed to attract criticism. Every silence was twisted into suspicion. She had left the palace to reclaim her freedom, but freedom had proven to be another battlefield. And now, with one decree, the monarchy had made its final statement. She was out. The emotional toll hit harder than she expected. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the symbolism. Titles had never meant much to her when she first joined the family. She had told friends she didn't care about hierarchy or protocol. But as time went on, those titles had become part of how the world understood her. Duchess of Sussex had been more than a title, it had been her shield. It gave legitimacy to her words, weight to her causes, a sense of belonging to something greater than fame. Without it, she felt naked in the public eye, stripped of context. The calls from the press began almost immediately. Some reporters offered sympathy, others sought reaction. A well-known television producer proposed an exclusive interview. "Your side of the story," they said. Meghan turned them all down. For the first time in her public life, she didn't want to speak. There was nothing left to explain. The crown had spoken louder than any interview ever could. Harry's anger filled the silence. He slammed the newspaper down on the table, his face flushed. "They had no right," he said. But Meghan knew that wasn't true. The monarchy had every right. That was the difference between their world and hers. Rights belonged to the institution, not the individuals inside it. She watched him pace, his fury familiar but now tinged with something deeper: helplessness. Harry had fought for her, defended her, distanced himself from his family for her. Yet here they were again, facing a decision they couldn't influence, dictated by forces older and colder than either of them. In the quiet moments that followed, Meghan's thoughts drifted to the symbolism of her removal. She imagined the royal archivists at work, deleting her title from digital registries, reprinting official documents, adjusting lines of succession charts. It was all clinical, methodical, indifferent. Her identity was being redacted like a classified file. Still, part of her wondered if this was inevitable. She had always believed that she could balance two worlds, the progressive ideals of Hollywood and the rigid order of the monarchy. But the two systems had never been designed to coexist. One thrived on transparency, the other on discretion. One demanded individuality, the other submission. Somewhere between those poles, Meghan had tried to build a bridge, but bridges rarely survive when both sides pull away. As the day went on, she began to sense the enormity of what had happened. Friends from across the world reached out, some offering comfort, others urging her to fight back. "You can't let them define your story," one message read. Another said, "This is your moment to rise again." Yet Meghan wasn't thinking about narratives or comebacks. For once, she allowed herself to sit in the stillness, to feel the weight of loss before planning the next move. The next morning, photographers gathered outside the gates of her estate. Long-range lenses peeked through trees. Reporters whispered near the driveway. The woman who had once symbolized royal modernity was again reduced to a headline. She drew the curtains and stayed inside. She didn't want to see the flash of cameras or the pity in headlines pretending to offer empathy. When Harry eventually convinced her to take a walk in the garden, she moved slowly, as though the air itself had thickened. Every sound, the crunch of gravel, the chirp of birds, felt exaggerated against the quiet rage simmering inside her. She wasn't angry at the king or Anne. She was angry at the inevitability of it all, the way the monarchy had always managed to win. Not through confrontation, but through permanence. They didn't shout, they signed. They didn't argue, they decreed. For the rest of the world, this was a story about titles and power. For Meghan, it was about belonging. She had tried to belong to the royal family, to the institution, to a vision of service that transcended borders. When that failed, she had tried to belong to a new identity, independent, entrepreneurial, outspoken. But even that freedom now felt hollow, tainted by loss. In the following days, she revisited the small tokens of her royal past. A wedding photograph framed in silver, letters from charity patrons, a note from the late Queen written during her first pregnancy. She ran her fingers over the paper, tracing the elegant handwriting. The words were formal but kind. Service, when done sincerely, brings peace. For a fleeting moment, Meghan wondered whether she had misunderstood what service meant. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. The woman looking back was not the glamorous figure the world remembered, but someone older, wearier. The exhaustion around her eyes told the story of years spent defending herself against perception. Yet beneath that fatigue, a spark of defiance still lingered. The monarchy could erase her titles, but not her voice. As the sun set over California that evening, Meghan finally picked up her phone. Not to issue a statement, but to open a blank note. She began to write. Not a response, not a rebuttal, but thoughts. Words that might one day become part of something larger. A speech, a letter, or perhaps a new beginning. She didn't know yet, but writing had always been her way back to control. The world outside continued to debate, analyze, and speculate, but inside that quiet room, Meghan's focus narrowed. The crown had drawn its line. Now she had to decide how to live on the other side of it. She paused, staring at the words she had written. "They can take the title," she murmured softly, "but not the story." It was a small declaration, barely audible, but in that moment it felt like reclaiming something that couldn't be revoked by decree. And so began Meghan's breaking point. Not the end of her story, but the moment she realized that every crown carries a cost, and some costs can never be repaid. Harry's fury was instant, unfiltered, and absolute. The moment the words reached him, he didn't speak. He erupted. One of his aides later said it was the first time they'd seen him so visibly shaken since his mother's funeral. The news flashed across his phone in bold type, the same phone that had once carried messages from palace aides and family members. But this time, it carried a verdict. The king had officially signed the order to strip Meghan of all royal titles. For a long moment, he couldn't process it. His pulse pounded, his throat tightened. The words blurred. By order of His Majesty King Charles III, with the counsel of Her Royal Highness Princess and... He read them again, slower this time, as though repetition could somehow dull their meaning. But it didn't. It only deepened the sting. He stood in the middle of the living room, gripping his phone as though it might shatter in his hand. Across the room, Meghan sat silently, her expression distant. He wanted to protect her, to fix it, to reverse it. But how do you fight a crown? He stormed out to the garden without a word. The California air felt too soft, too still for the kind of rage burning inside him. He paced the path that wound through the olive trees, his jaw clenched, muttering under his breath. Reporters would soon be outside. Headlines were already being written. His father and his aunt had done it, formally, publicly, and without warning. For years, Harry had believed that no matter how strained things became, the line between family and institution would hold. He thought his father might understand that even in disagreement, there would be some sacred limit to what the monarchy could do to its own blood. But this was a declaration. It wasn't just about titles. It was the palace saying, "You are no longer part of us." He returned inside and slammed the door behind him. "They've erased her," he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Do you understand what that means? They've actually erased her." Meghan didn't answer. She looked at him, eyes tired but calm. "Harry," she whispered, "we knew it was coming. That only made it worse." The calmness in her voice, the quiet acceptance, felt unbearable to him. "You don't just accept this," he said. "You fight it." He moved toward the table, grabbing a newspaper already filled with reactions from royal commentators. "Listen to this. A necessary correction for the crown." "A correction? They talk about us like we're a stain they had to scrub out." She stood, approaching him slowly. "You can't fight them on their terms," she said softly. "That's how they win." But Harry wasn't listening. His fury was raw, fueled by years of resentment that had never fully healed. To him, this was the final betrayal. Not the interviews, not the icy silences, not the headlines, but this quiet, bureaucratic act that turned his wife's life into a footnote. He sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. Memories flooded back. His wedding day, the sea of faces at Windsor, his father smiling awkwardly as he walked Meghan down the aisle. He had believed that day was a bridge between old and new, tradition and change. Now that bridge lay in ruins, burned from both ends. "Do you think he hesitated?" Harry asked suddenly. Meghan looked confused. "When he signed it," he continued, "do you think he even paused? Or did he just put his name down and move on to the next paper?" Meghan didn't respond. She knew that question wasn't meant for her. It was a wound speaking aloud. Harry's anger wasn't just about the decree. It was about everything that had led to it. The silence after their departure, the cold statements, the public blame, the feeling that the family he'd bled for no longer recognized him. That night, Harry opened a bottle of wine but never drank from it. He sat by the window, watching the lights of Montecito flicker across the hills. He imagined the palace at that same hour. Lamplit corridors, quiet footsteps, guards stationed outside the king's study. He could picture his father sitting at that desk, pen in hand, his sister standing beside him. He could almost hear Anne's voice, clipped and certain. "It must be done." He slammed his fist against the armrest. "She was my wife. My choice." His voice broke on the last word. Meghan placed her hand gently on his arm, but he pulled away, not in anger at her, but at the helplessness he felt. For the first time, he truly understood the weight of what it meant to defy the crown. You could leave the palace, you could move continents, but you could never escape its reach. Over the following days, Harry's anger hardened into purpose. He contacted his legal team, demanded full copies of the decree, wanted to know every clause, every constitutional justification. He drafted statements that he never sent, rants that began with fury and ended in despair. "They've humiliated her," he said repeatedly. "They've turned her into an example."